Nothing's certain in politics, but professionals know one thing. Subscribing to the Cook Political Report is the right decision in every election cycle.
For more than 4 decades, the Cook Political Report has been providing political professionals with the right analysis to help them invest political capital with confidence.
A deep knowledge of the past, combined with a meticulous, unbiased analysis of the present, produces the most accurate predictions of the future, time and time again.
Because it's all backed by data from every input that decides elections for president, Congress, and governorships.
Subscribers to the Cook Political Report get the clarity they need through smart analysis that you won't get anywhere else.
Like the very latest outlook for every race and access to our analysts. Amy Walter, David Wasserman, Carrie Dan, Jessica Taylor, Aaron Covey, and Matthew Klein.
The Cook Political Report offers
the right analysis,
The right analysis.
The right analysis.
The right analysis.
for getting it right. Go to cookpolitical.com/subscribe. Hey there, welcome to The Odd Years. I'm Amy Walter. Election administration may not be the sexiest topic out there, but it's something many of us have started paying close attention to these days. President Trump, who still refuses to accept the results of the 2020 election, has made influencing how we vote a major part of his second term. From attempts to force states to turn over voting rolls, to changing rules on mail-in voting, to broader attempts to nationalize election oversight ahead of the midterms. That's why I wanted to talk with someone who's covering all these issues closely and can separate real threats to election integrity from ones that aren't likely to pan out. And so I bring you today Nathaniel Rakich. He is the managing editor of the nonpartisan Votebeat. They cover the administration of elections and voting with journalists on the ground in 5 states. In this conversation, Nathaniel does a fantastic job explaining where the pressure points are in our voting system, where President Trump's efforts have stalled, where they've succeeded, and what to watch for as we move toward Election Day this November. Most important, I think, is that if you are one of these people freaking out about whether this election will be free, fair, and/or functional, Nathaniel, well, he'll help you feel a little less stressed. Take a listen. Nathaniel Rakich, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
I think the most important thing before we really dig into the meat of our conversation is, if for those of us who are watching might notice what is behind Nathaniel on a bookshelf. For those of you who are just listening, Nathaniel, can you describe what is behind you and how you got such a thing?
Yeah, so that is the sound of 2 mac and cheese boxes, Kraft mac and cheese boxes from the 2004 DNC and RNC that they gave out as like party favors. One of them is macaroni and cheese in the shape of donkeys, and the other is macaroni and cheese in the shape of elephants. And they are just very cute. This was like one of my first kind of political, like big boy political experiences growing up. And I've had them ever since. They are expired, as you can imagine, so I will not be eating them. But they make for very good podcast background fodder.
They do make for, it seems so quaint as well, the
Yes.
idea that we could sum up a convention with a box of macaroni and cheese. That it feels very different from the conventions we've been through of the last few years. All right, now I'm going to just get right into the meat of it, because Nathaniel, you are the managing editor of Votebeat. The mission of Votebeat is to be a nonpartisan local reporting about elections and voting. So you are in the center of, I think, one of the most important questions of this election, which is, how confident are you that these upcoming midterm elections are going to be free, fair, and functional?
It's a big question. And, thank you for having me on to talk about it because, like you guys at the Cook Political Report, I am a complete sucker for, following the polls and the twists and turns of every race. But the mechanics of democracy are really what undergird that. And it's something that we have all taken for granted throughout most of our career, but has kind of increasingly become under question or under threat, depending on kind of, your level of alarm. I would say that we at Votebeat try to strike a very middle of the road tone with regard to this, because I do think that there are clearly things in the atmosphere, namely President Trump, his false claims of election fraud back in 2020 and also ongoing election fraud. He just truthed yesterday that he said that the primary election in Michigan was rigged. I'm not sure exactly what his concern there is, considering it was a primary and it wasn't even that a Republican loss. But he has obviously continued to kind of sow these seeds of doubt. He has not kind of let go of his loss in 2020. Now that he is back in power, he has used a lot of the levers that are available to him in the federal government to try to involve the federal government to an unprecedented degree in election administration. I'm sure we'll talk about some of the details, but I think that those are very real threats that the system of localized elections faces. And, we haven't talked about things like whether ICE agents will show up at polling places before. So that is different. That is very clearly different. And there are concerns, absolutely. That said, some of the more alarmist concerns about canceling the midterms or just outright, ignoring the results or overturning the results, I think are exaggerated, right? So our election system is very decentralized. That makes it very hard to monkey with. There are literally thousands of dedicated professional election officials who want to do a good job, who are legally obligated to do a good job at administering the election and making sure that everybody's votes are counted fairly. And I do have faith that in them. There are definitely ways where the system could break down. We saw that a bit in 2020, although it should be noted that the system ultimately held. Obviously, there were a lot of tragic things that happened on the way, namely January 6th, but the transfer of power did happen. And so I think that we could be in for a rocky kind of midterm in terms of the election administration and certification side of things. But I think at the end of the day, will our democracy hold? Yes. But could there be some very concerning things that happen in the middle there? Also, yes.
Yes, that is an excellent summation, Nathaniel. So let's then walk through where those, whether we want to call them speed bumps or whether we're going to call them like significant challenges, could be to getting the ultimate outcome certified. The first would be the role of the federal government. As you note, and in your website's About Us section, as well as you say continually, because it is true, elections are administered by the states. And yet, the federal government is trying to make a very concerted effort to insert itself in the conduct of elections, whether it is over the United States Postal Service ability to mail out ballots, to the threat of withholding federal funds from states that do not hand over state voting rolls to the federal government. Can you tell us how significant a role fundamentally you think that the federal government is going to have in this election and what it could tell us about the role it will take in subsequent elections?
Yeah, definitely. So I think that you're absolutely right. And I think, just as kind of like a little illustration of this, Votebeat's whole setup is that we have reporters in 5 key swing states. But for the first time this year, we have hired a national reporter because, even though voting is local, there are all these issues happening on the national level. And so you can kind of see how the window has shifted there. I think that the federal government's role in the election will ultimately be quite small. I think probably comparable to past years at the end of the day. But this is not for lack of trying, right? And I think this is a key part, right? Basically, since Trump retook office last year, he has tried to get get into kind of local election administration and basically every door that's available to him, right? So he has issued, I think most prominently, 2 executive orders trying to do things like dictate what kind of voting machines can be used. That was last year's executive order. There was this year's executive order, which, as you mentioned, is on the Postal Service. And basically it directed the Postal Service. It was complicated and the mechanisms weren't exactly clear, and I'll spare you the gory details. But basically the upshot was the U.S. Postal Service would get to decide who is eligible to vote by mail, which of course is something that is currently state law. But importantly, and you'll notice this as a pattern, those executive orders have been held up in court. And we are actually, I was hoping we were going to get a ruling before we did this podcast.
I know, because it's supposed to.
Yeah.
Yes, it is. Is this going to make its way to the Supreme Court?
Yes. So currently, as we are recording, which is Thursday at 1 p.m., it is sitting before the Supreme Court. A lower court had put an injunction on this Postal Service executive order saying that it can't be used for the 2026 midterms. The Supreme Court's going to decide that on the shadow docket really at any time now. It should be noted that even if they decide to lift that injunction, the narrow legal question before the Supreme Court is actually like whether the injunction was premature. So that doesn't mean that another injunction can't be issued later on closer to the election. So there are actually still many steps between now and the election where this could get tripped up. But anyway, the general theme, and you've seen this in other areas too, like with the president's attempt to get voter rolls from various states. Court after court has said, no, you can't do that. The Constitution is clear. Only states with under kind of laws passed by Congress can run elections. And so the president has run into a lot of these legal barriers. So even though he has tried to do things like issue these executive orders, he has tried to get his Department of Justice and Department of Homeland Security to essentially get their hands on voting rolls, to comb them over for non-citizens. As you've mentioned, he's used these kind of like soft power almost, like threats of withholding funds, threats of prosecution if election officials knowingly let non-citizens vote, which of course they are not doing. He has tried every single lever at his disposal to do this, and so far courts have shot them all down. And or in the case of like those threats, state election officials have been like, we're doing our jobs. Like, we're going to do our jobs regardless of what the president says. And to their credit, they haven't been kind of intimidated by it, which is, I think, another general concern in the air of, the president's perhaps an undue influence on certain local election officials, as, again, he tried to do in 2020 in Georgia, for instance.
But Nathaniel, are there differences between the way that blue state administrative officials, election administrative officials, are dealing with the White House versus red state? In other words, are red state secretaries of state or other holders of this voter information actually giving the White House what they want, and it's only the blue states that aren't? And what would that look like if you are a voter in a red state versus a blue state?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is yes, there are differences, but I would say they are matters of degrees. There are very few state level or local level officials who are as far to the right as Trump on this, who are completely in lockstep with him. So obviously the Democratic secretaries of state out there, when Trump is trying to get their voter rolls or whatever, they're telling him to pound sand. They're issuing these very partisan statements about, we're never going to let Donald Trump take over Colorado's elections, things like that. The red states, some of them have given over, for instance, the voter roll. So I think it's around 16 or 18 Republican-led states have shared their voter data with the Department of Justice. A similar number have run their data through the DHS database known as SAVE, which is essentially, it existed before last year, but it was highly upgraded last year by the Trump administration to be used as a voter verification tool. It pulls in data from all sorts of federal databases, and it also allows states to bulk upload their voter rolls into it, and basically it spits out a list of people it thinks are non-citizens. The issue is that there is no reliable federal database of non-citizens or of citizens, and so the states are finding that these checks are spitting out a lot of false positives. And so I think Texas is a really good example. That is obviously a Republican-led state. They ran their data through SAVE. They shared their voter rolls. They've been cooperating kind of outwardly with the Trump administration. But when they got that data back, they were like, oh, you know what, actually, this was not so helpful. This flagged a lot of citizens. And so now they are kind of going through the process of undoing some of those changes that they made and like reinstating people onto the voter rolls who were erroneously removed. And obviously that is a concern, I think particularly for a lot of voting rights groups and Democratic groups. They talk about voter purges. There's currently something going on in Alaska right now where they took a number of people off the voter rolls for allegedly being non-citizens that it turns out similarly a fair number of them aren't. So those fights are happening, but it's also over a fairly small number of voters. And so this is, if we're talking about kind of like the impact on voters, check to see if you are registered, especially if you're in a state that has an earlier voter registration deadline. Pretty much every state, to my knowledge, has a website where you can go. You can input your information, and it'll tell you, yes, you're registered, and this is the party you're registered with or whatever. If you're concerned about that, that's the best thing that you can do. But yeah, so to summarize, like blue states and red states are reacting differently, but even the red states are not mustache twirling, trying to disenfranchise people. They are also doing their jobs and going through the checks that are in place for a reason.
I think that's a really good point, because I think people will hear something you mentioned, two states, Texas and Alaska, both of which have very high profile Senate races, right? Control of the Senate could come down to those states. And in fact, control of the Senate does run through red states. And so I think the concern of some, especially on the Democratic side, is, well, could we win the election but lose the legal battle over this? And to that point, there was a story today, I'm trying to pull this up here in the New York Times, which I'm sure you've seen, about the number of election officials in states who are either outright supporters of the president's claims that the 2020 election was rigged, or have been in other ways sort of circumspect about the rules and laws of their state. How concerned should people be about that? If indeed the system, as you said, held up in 2020, a lot of the reason it held up was that these local officials were like, absolutely not. I'm not bowing to the pressure from a political leader. I'm going to do my job.
Yeah, absolutely. That article was very good. And I think that it does kind of in a similar way to how I framed it initially, right? It shows that the threat is there, but it also shows kind of how limited the threat is, right? So there are a handful of election officials. I don't remember the exact number that the Times identified, but I think it was like 60 or something like that.
Yes, they're like 72 or some number. Yeah. You're right. It's not in the thousands.
It is a double-digit number.
Yes.
Of election officials that they identified who kind of agree with the election denialism claims that Trump and others have made. But again, nationwide, there are thousands of election jurisdictions, right? It is not just we're not talking about state election officials here. We are talking about the county and city and township level clerks. And there are literally thousands of counties and cities and towns around the country, right? And so I think that it's important to know that, yes, those people exist, and that is concerning, particularly for people in those areas, but also they are a very small fraction. Also, there are a lot of checks and balances in the system, right? So the election infrastructure is a ladder, right? And it goes down from the most local level, like on the precinct level, literally the poll workers who are checking you in, to the top election official in the state, usually the Secretary of State. And all those people are overseeing each other, right? When you certify an election, it goes kind of like up the chain in the same way when you're counting the results. But so one of the cases that was highlighted in that Times article was Antrim County, Michigan. And Michigan is one of our states at Votebeat. And our reporter, Haley Harding, broke the story of this election official who, in this northern Republican, deeply Republican county, was basically taking people off of the rolls in an unauthorized way. But the reason that this was caught was that the Secretary of State of Michigan, who is a Democrat, has visibility into that and was noticing, hey, there are people disappearing from the rolls in an unauthorized way in Antrim County. What's going on there? And they basically sent a strongly worded letter to her and ultimately ended up threatening her with criminal charges, suspending her from her duties until she kind of knocked it off. In Michigan, they're also, so they're both counties county clerks and like local clerks. And so the local clerks were finding out that it was the county clerk who was doing this in Antrim County, but the local clerks were finding out that this was happening to their voters, and then they were able to contact those voters, re-add them. So ultimately, the kind of the checks and the balances that are built into the system are able to hold. Like, I think the real concern is if you had election deniers up and down that chain, but there are really no instances where that is the case. And even in in like a dark red state, a place like Wyoming, which is a state whose Secretary of State is someone who has been sympathetic to Trump's claims, they think that the problems are somewhere else, right? Wyoming elections are great from their perspective because they're the ones running the elections. They're looking at the Philadelphia's and the Detroits of the world and saying that's where the fraud is happening. So there's kind of a self-reinforcing aspect of it too.
There is, although as you know, Nathaniel, you can be, well, and Georgia was a perfect example of this. We know the way for a Democrat to win in a red state like Georgia is to run up the score in Atlanta and Fulton County, right? And so you, as a Republican election official, you can say the state's voting is great, except for this one county, right? And this can happen in, it could honestly happen in a blue or purple state. If you're Republicans, you could say, well, why, if Mike Rogers loses that Senate race in Michigan, it will be because Democrats rigged the ballots in Wayne County, in Detroit. How can people feel confident that even though you may have a red part of a state in a blue state, or a red or a blue part of a state in a red state, that they will not be, I don't know, there's not a nefarious intent in the way that the votes are ultimately counted and certified?
Yeah, I mean, I think it does go down to just the number of checks there are on the process, right? Is that, first of all, a lot of election officials are nonpartisan, right? Especially like the poll workers and the people who are actually doing the counting, right? Maybe right.
Believe it or not, America, a lot of people do this.
Yeah,
or that they have opinions about politics. They're not naive. They just do not believe that the correct way to do democracy in America is to ensure that only your side wins. Right?
Yes, exactly.
They firmly believe in that.
Yeah. I talk to Democratic and Republican election officials all the time who say that, I got into this because, and these are like the local level people who aren't necessarily using a Secretary of State as like a stepping stone to the governorship, for instance. But they say like, I got into this because I believe in democracy and like my duty is to the voters, and I may have an opinion about the best way to serve them. But like, I don't believe in my side winning all the time. Like sometimes we're going to lose, and that's fine. That's democracy. So yeah, there are a lot of people who still share that, perhaps, quaint sounding belief. But there are a lot of people like that. But then there are just also so many checks on the process. So like, right, like it'll be the local, like, votes get counted at a precinct, like on the local level, and then it gets, tossed up to the, city or township level or the county level, and then it gets tossed up to the state level. And, there are audits at every stage of this. We all, I think, went through this together in 2020, right? There are essentially like recounts that happen. The results are double checked. There are ample opportunities for like the parties send observers to go, and the federal government even sends observers to go and monitor and make sure that all these processes are happening, kind of transparently, and that there's no funny business. There are opportunities to challenge, ballots that are, discarded, for instance, or whole kind of like ballot, like categories of ballots that are counted or not counted, and then the certification process kind of happens, and that is a very they call it a ministerial duty, and as we found out in like 2022, for instance, in Cochise County, Arizona, and a couple of other places, even when a local election official is like, I don't think this election was above board, I'm not going to certify it, legally they have to. It is a pro forma thing, and so courts ultimately compelled these people to certify the election. So again, that's a perfect example of what I mean when I say like it could get a little hairy there. It may not be as automatic as we have been used to, but at the end of the day, the institutions that have been set in place to make sure that these things happen, that elections are fairly certified and counted, they should hold.
Thank you for giving us those examples. I think that's really important for people to understand that, yes, there can be rogue agents. There can be people who say things like, I'm not certifying this because in my gut, I have no proof of this, but in my gut believe that something happened that undermines the integrity of this election. There are so many redundancies in place that make that one rogue person or one rogue action. It's not that it minimizes the impact of that rogue action, right?
Right, exactly.
And potentially, really, just beyond minimizing it ensures that rogue action is not what changes the course of the election. Yeah,
Exactly.
I think that is so important. A quick break. We'll be back with Nathaniel Rakich.
Hey there, it's Erin Covey, the House editor here at the Cook Political Report. Did you know we have another podcast called Editors Roundtable? It comes out once a week and features me and my colleagues pulling back the curtain to let you in on all of our insights on races, ratings changes, polling, and everything else we'll be following this midterm year. You can find Editors Roundtable on Apple Podcasts for just $1.99 a month, or become a paying subscriber to our new Cook Political Report Substack. All this is linked in the episode's show notes.
Your folks, you manage how many reporters there?
I personally manage 3, but we have
Okay.
6 reporters now with the national reporter. So we have reporters in Michigan, Arizona, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Texas.
So in talking to them with their on-the-ground reporting, talk to us sort of about the human side of this, because again, I think we spend so much time, especially those of us here in Washington, thinking about this as this, if you're on the Trump side of this, believing that there's some deep conspiracy to rig elections against Republicans, but most specifically against President Trump. This idea that there's a deep state that has penetrated the agencies in charge of administering elections. There are people on the left that read a story like in the New York Times that believe that there are these moles that have come in. Talk about just who these people really are, who are the state and, as you said, the county, the local precinct folks engaged in these elections.
Yeah, they really run the gamut, right? There are people from all walks of life. So, secretaries of state, which are probably the most visible election officials and the people that, listening to this podcast have probably heard of, they're more politicians, right? They, as I mentioned, often it is kind of a stepping stone for them to higher office. But especially on the local level, it's people who, just kind of like wanted to get involved in their civic life and want to help their friends and their neighbors. In a state like Wisconsin and Michigan, which are 2 of the most decentralized states in the country for these things, every town has its own election official, its own town clerk. And in some of these small towns in like northern Michigan or northern Wisconsin, I mean, we are talking towns of 50 people. And there are people who kind of get like, you roped, there maybe like there's the local town clerk has been in office for 40 years and he retires. And so he goes and says to his neighbor, hey, like, you do a great job at this.
Right.
And then they step in. And for a lot of these people, it's a part-time job. They're like a local teacher or a firefighter or something like that and doing this on the side. A lot of them are doing it for multiple communities because they're in a place like Wisconsin, rural Wisconsin, there just aren't enough people to be doing this job for every municipality. So they really are some of the most down-to-earth and like dedicated people that I have kind of interacted with, in my time as a journalist. It really is like, if you talk about like, if people want to kind of have faith in the system again, talk to these people or become, I think like the best way is to like become a local poll worker right in your community. And you will be talking with the other people who run the election. And you can it's really quite inspiring. This sounds very corny and, sappy, but like it is true.
It is true. It is true. I like that.
Yeah, I used to be a poll worker in my former hometown of Somerville, Massachusetts. So shout out to Somerville. But the other piece of it the human piece, that I do want to talk about is the toll that it takes,
Yes.
especially these last 6 years. Right, is that between COVID and the physical, logistical issues that presented, and also like all this election denialism stuff and the death threats that these people sometimes get. Being an election official in America has never been harder, and the amount of turnover that we have seen. I think I was talking to the Connecticut Secretary of State like a couple months ago, and I think she said something like 40% of local election officials had turned over since, I think it was 2020, but I don't remember the exact year. But this is the scale that we're talking about. And of course, new people have to step into those roles, and recruiting them is hard enough, but then you have to train them and everything like that. Like it's a real burden, and people get burned out very quickly. So I think that is the other aspect that all of this mistrust around elections has begotten, which is just that these people who are going into these jobs wanting to do good for their communities and to, with a very kind of noble, idealistic idea of civic life, are meeting a very harsh reality of people who distrust the system, people who are giving them a hard time. And that's not good for democracy either, because when you see these places that have the turnover, like that's often where you see problems happening, not nefarious problems, but like things like misplaced ballots, which is an issue that we saw in a Michigan town last year. Those mistakes can happen. And again, it's not nefarious, but those people's votes aren't counted, and that is really unfortunate.
The other thing I'd love for you to help us understand is the role that the courts are going to play in this election. Again, Nathaniel, you and I talk about campaigns all the time. We love the point until election day. And then once election day is over, it's kind of out of our hands. It's in the hands of whether it's recounts or there are lawsuits. Is your expectation that so much of the outcome of 2026 won't be known until the courts actually have their say?
I mean, it depends entirely on the number of challenges, right? And I think that a lot of that depends on the outcomes, or like the closeness of the race, right? Like, I think one thing that I always tell people is, who are concerned that, Trump is going to quote unquote steal the midterms, is that, if Democrats win the House by 25 seats, like there's nothing you can do about that, right? It's if the House comes down to like one seat, or like the Senate, I think is obviously the place that is more likely to come down to one seat, and that decisive race ends up being, one of these squeakers by like 100 votes or something like that. That's the real danger zone, right? And that's a place that you're going to see a lot of people jump in with those court challenges. And in that case, yes, absolutely, the courts will be the kind of ultimate arbiter of the election. But I think that, in a case where, let's say that Democrats win the House comfortably, and maybe Democrats come up short in the Senate. In that case, I think that we can probably, hopefully, we will the results whenever we end up getting them, which obviously that can take a couple of days after the actual election day. Hopefully, once we get those projections from the AP and other folks, that will be kind of the end of the story.
Right. One other question I get a lot, and I'm sure you do as well, is the role in which potential federal enforcement may be out, federal law enforcement, whether that's ICE or the National Guard, things like that, showing up in and around polling places. I know you interviewed recently a number of experts and asked them the same question about whether they expected to see that sort of presence at polling places. What did they tell you, and what do you think?
Yeah, this is what I would say that most experts are most worried about, because when you think about kind of like the spectrum, all the possibilities of things that the federal government could do to try to interfere with the midterms, right? Like I mentioned, the extreme outcomes of actually overturning the election, or certainly canceling it, are off the table because they're just not logistically or legally possible. On the other hand, you've had all these like proposed changes to election law through like the executive orders, and also the Save America Act, which of course is stalled in the Senate. All of that stuff, those efforts seem to have failed. And we are now obviously in August now. We're almost exactly 3 months away from the election. The rules that are in place now are almost certainly going to be the rules that are in place. But I think it is this kind of period of on election day or like during voting or immediately thereafter that is seen as the most vulnerable point. And I think there are a few ways that this could take, right? It could look like troops showing up to polls on election day to disrupt voting, or at least just kind of like milling around and potentially, intimidating people away. It should be noted that sending armed troops to election sites is illegal. That if that were to happen, which who knows, right? This is speculative. But if that were to happen, I think that there are a lot of election officials, again, who I talk to who are preparing for this because it's been in the air so much. They are building relationships with their local law enforcement, putting them on speed dial, putting like courts, like on speed dial and things like that. If somebody like ICE were to show up at a polling place, they can call their local sheriff and get them there, within minutes, and the sheriff can be like, hey, you can't be here. Go away. And hopefully that's the end of that. But that's kind of the response to that. But also no troops should be showing up to polling places, period. So if we've gotten to that point.
Well, that's right. And if word is spreading, even if ultimately they leave,
Right.
they're asked
Exactly.
to leave, just the threat alone. And as you're talking to these election officials, is that a concern of theirs? Is that just the very fact we're having this conversation, the very fact that you and I have to raise this concern, do they expect to see voter turnout impacted? And that, especially in certain communities, voter turnout will be down. Are they working to help make those voters feel as if they will be safe and that they shouldn't feel intimidated about voting?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Nobody will kind of say that they expect lower turnout. I think that everyone's hope, whether they are secretly have this fear
Right.
but just don't want to project it,
Right.
or whether they truly believe that everything will be fine. Like everyone's hope is that it's not going to be an issue, and we're going to educate people and make them feel safe and come out to vote and stuff. I have heard them talk about like ways that they are going to try to reassure voters that this won't happen or that they'll be protected. One thing that's common is that election officials are reminding people, hey, if you are nervous about going to a polling place, there are other ways to vote, right?
Vote
You
by
can vote
mail
by
or-
mail in most states without an excuse. You can vote early, at a time when it's going to be less busy, and presumably, the eyes of the world
Right.
and potentially of the president will be on, polling places in Texas or whatever. So there are all those alternatives. I do tend to think that, the other thing that we have seen, and I think a lot about the case in North Dakota, and I believe it was 2018, when there was an effort to restrict Native American voting rights in that Senate race, but then turnout ended up being like above average. I think that you also see a kind of a counter effect where people who feel like their rights are being threatened or like somebody doesn't want them to vote get even more determined to go and vote. And I think between that and just general interest in the election, and the fact that there are going to be so many forces from the campaigns and from like official government entities trying to get people to go out to vote, I am optimistic that the overall turnout numbers will continue to be high. We're in a very high engagement time in politics, as you well know. So I don't think you're going to see it on a holistic level, but I think you're right that like, is it possible to see an instance where at one polling place in, El Paso, ICE agents show up for 15 minutes and then they leave, but maybe that specific polling place, people don't, like the turnout is low there. That is not enough probably to swing the outcome of the Texas Senate election, but like that's not cool either.
Right. For those of us who want to follow you and your team going into this election, number one, tell us how to do that. And number two, where are you guys going to be on election day and afterwards? What's the work that you're doing so that we can say, okay, so what really happened and what is happening? Are you going to be following along as votes are being cast in these states and any of the challenges or other things that may be happening in those states? How are you following that?
Yeah, absolutely. So our website is votebeat.org. We have a great, we have a newsletter for every state that we're in, but also a national newsletter. And I would say that probably for this audience, our national newsletter is a really good resource if you're interested in this stuff. It comes out weekly every Saturday, just kind of summarizes, is usually like whatever has happened in the world of election administration that week, and kind of looking ahead to the midterms. Yes, so that's that. And then for election day, we have our reporters in the states. They are going to be, on the ground there. So our Michigan reporter, obviously with the Michigan primary this past week, she was at the Detroit Counting Center until 2 a.m. Our Wisconsin reporter is going to be doing the same thing in Milwaukee next week. And on general election day, they're all going to be in kind of the probably the biggest, vote-rich areas in their respective states. And then, in the days after the election, that's really the unpredictable part, right? And then, we will be following whatever stories happen. If there are challenges, if there are, shenanigans, we'll certainly be on top of covering that as well.
I love that you got the word shenanigan in there. It's an underused word, and it can capture so much, right? It just is a catch-all for the time that we exist in. Nathaniel Rakich, this was really, really helpful. You are so good at giving us a sober, but realistic look at what to expect for election administration. And I look forward to having another conversation with you as we get right up into Election Day.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to The Odd Years. If you liked what you heard or want to make a suggestion, leave us a review or recommend us to a friend. You're our best way to get the word out about what we do. And if you want more from the Cook Political Report, consider becoming a subscriber. Go to cookpolitical.com/subscribe. Listeners can use the discount code ODD10, that's ODD, the number 10, to save 10% on any subscription. This offer is available only to new subscribers. The Odd Years is brought to you by the Cook Political Report and is produced by Becca Kaufman.